you already know me. As well as leading CEI, I also lead the lobster research here. All my family are lobster fishermen, so this is pretty near and dear to my heart.
My name is Whit Lauer. I'm an Island School teaching fellow and advisor, and I'm an advisor for this lobster research team.
I'm Sebastian Höfer, research assistant here at CEI and advisor for the Lobster class.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. We are the Island School Lobster Research Team. My name is Quinn McGowan.
I'm Maya Salem.
I'm Thomas McGaffigan.
I'm Ella Ernest.
I'm Ben Emery.
I'm Katie Palmer.
I'm Will Ide.
So, the Caribbean spiny lobster is the most heavily fished marine species in all of the Bahamas. Of all fish caught, lobsters represent 80 to 90% of the economic value, and on average, about 13.2 million lobsters are caught annually. However, the lobster fishing industry has only recently been certified as the only sustainable lobster fishery in all the Caribbean, so there's still so much work to be done with that. In order for a fishery to be considered sustainable, there must be a stable population for the target species, there must be minimal environmental impacts, and the rules governing that species must be effective. This semester as a group, we investigated the effects of dead lobster heads on the behavior of the triggerfish, which is the lobster's main predator, and how that may impact the Caribbean spiny lobster species as a whole.
So this is a Caribbean spiny lobster, and this is a molt from one of the lobsters we use in our experiments that you'll hear about later. And when the fishermen catch these lobsters, they quickly detach the head from the tail and throw the heads back into the water because the tail has more meat and more value to the fishermen because there's limited space on the boat, so they throw the heads overboard. And as Quinn stated, also there's a regulation that states that the tail must be at least 5.5 inches for a fisherman to keep it. And also, as Quinn stated earlier, 13.2 million lobsters are caught annually and the heads thrown back into the water. And to put that into perspective, if you were to line up the lobster discards, it would stretch from campus all the way to Boston. There have been various studies on the sustainability of this fishery, but no one has ever looked into this certain fishing practice and its possible effects on the predator behavior and the wider ecosystems. And our research team has spent this past semester examining whether or not this is sustainable for lobster populations.
Thank you, Maya. So, what are we trying to test? We start off with the question, what are the impacts of throwing dead lobster heads back in the water? And specifically, does this impact the behavior of triggerfish, which are major lobster predators? The dead heads could be a significant food source for the triggerfish, which might reduce their appetite for attacking live lobsters. We are trying to understand if this has any effect on the rate of predation on lobsters. So our specific hypotheses are, the rate of predation will be lower when there is a dead lobster head present. Number 2, triggerfish will prefer to eat dead lobster heads rather than attack live lobsters. We came up with our hypotheses by our observations through fieldwork and the fact that so many lobster heads were being thrown back in the water. As stated before, this has never been tested, so nobody knows the actual effects of throwing the lobster heads back in the water, and we're trying to figure out if it's sustainable.
So in order to answer these questions, we ran several behavioral experiments in the wet labs over at CEI, where we looked at how triggerfish predation on lobsters was affected by lobster head discards in the industry. We did this by going out and catching both triggerfish and lobsters that we then used in one of 3 treatments used to carry out our trial. The first of which was the control, which was solely the cinder block and the triggerfish to give us a baseline. The second was the lobster treatment, where a triggerfish was observed with a live lobster. And lastly, the discard, where a triggerfish was observed with both a live lobster and a discarded lobster head. So each treatment was recorded for a 3-hour period, and the footage was reviewed to help us calculate our results. And special thanks to the interns who were a great help in sorting through all this footage along the way. So what this analysis looked like was receiving a video where we were to count for each interaction, attack, deem it successful or not, as well as take into account the duration of each. So here's the video. And as you can see in this first clip, this would be an unsuccessful attack as the lobster was able to get away from the triggerfish. Whereas in the second clip, this would be successful as the triggerfish was able to make multiple contacts with the lobster.
All right, so this graph represents the attacks on live lobsters. The y-axis shows the number of attacks each lobster receives, and the x-axis shows which scenario the lobster is being attacked in. These results are from when we placed a live lobster in a tank with a triggerfish. In a 3-hour period, the live lobster was attacked on average around 300 times. Now, these results are from when we placed a live lobster in a tank with both a triggerfish and a discarded head. The live lobster was attacked 98% fewer times than this scenario. Now, this graph is showing the attacks on live lobsters and discarded heads. The y-axis shows the number of attacks, and the x-axis shows which item the triggerfish chose to attack. These results are from when we placed a live lobster in a tank with both a triggerfish and a discarded head. So in other words, the triggerfish had a choice as to which food it wanted to eat. In a 3-hour period, the live lobster was attacked on average around 6 times compared to the discarded head, which was attacked around 200 times. This is a 97% difference.
So how do we interpret this data and what does it mean for our project? As Ben said was shown in the graphs, when there is a lobster discard present, the triggerfish will attack the live lobster noticeably less than when there is no head present. We performed controlled experiments, as Ella said, to analyze the interactions between a triggerfish and a cinder block in the closed habitat. This allowed us to definitely attribute the triggerfish attacking behavior to the lobster discard and not the cinder block in the tank. From this data, we can infer that a lobster discard being present decreases the rate of predator interactions with live lobsters. This evidence supports our working hypothesis that if it is given the option, a triggerfish will preferably attack a lobster discard rather than a live lobster, increasing the rate of survival rate of lobsters. These results ultimately suggest that the act of fishermen throwing these lobster heads overboard would decrease the predation pressure on lobsters in a natural environment.
So in conclusion, our research team has spent weeks trying to figure out the overall understanding if removing the lobster head from the lobster tail and throwing it into the ocean is a sustainable practice. We're the first group of soon many to research this. Our results suggest that lobster fishermen may be positively contributing to the overall sustainability of lobster populations. By discarding lobster heads into the ocean, predation levels on live lobsters decreases because their predators are getting fed. Our next steps would be to research this in a natural environment where we can test and measure rates of predation with a lobster head present. We'd also like to further our research on the understanding if it has any effects on the natural behavior of other species of fish and nurse sharks. We wonder how long these effects will last before it has a huge impact on the ecosystem. We'd like to give another big thanks to our teachers Nick, Whit, and Zeb, and also our interns Aaron and Catherine for helping us through this amazing journey, but also for all of you coming out and supporting us today. Thank you. This is our website. Any questions?
How does the triggerfish use spiny lobster? It appear to be a fair fight, right? I mean, I know that they're going to pause, but at the same time, getting underbelly, or how does that work?
So the question was, how does the triggerfish attack the lobster? So the lobster's main defense mechanism is with its antennas, and they move backwards. So the triggerfish will first go for the antennas, and then it'll go for the eyes and try and blind it, so it's easier to attack the abdomen, which is how the lobster will die. And that's basically its mechanism.
Is it a new practice to throw the heads back, or have they been doing that always?
The question was, is this fishing practice a new fishing practice? And
So that we didn't really study, but for right now, we know that fishermen throw the heads back because there is little to no meat, and also that waste storage on the boat. So fishermen are constantly trying to get as many get as much meat as they can to store in their boat, because they'll go out for weeks at a time, and that would just take up space. So I think that's like one of the main reasons why everyone's doing it today. Yeah.
So I'm wondering, when you were observing the triggerfish with the discarded head, whether or not there was, for lack of a better word, like frustration, like did they get what they needed from it, or did they act the same way once they had the head as when they had the live lobster?
So the question is with the discarded head, was there, for lack of a better term, frustration for the triggerfish, and that was its intention for attacking the discarded head, or if the behavior was the same between the two? So from analyzing our results, we found that when there was a discarded head, the triggerfish would immediately attack the head. And we found that this is an easier target for the triggerfish, as there's no fight back, and it is exerting very little energy to do so, so it will preferably attack that. And when there's only a lobster, the triggerfish finds that that is the only prey available to it, and therefore it has to attack the lobster.
But is there enough food with the discarded head? Or do they eat the tail if they got the whole lobster?
So the question was, do triggerfish eat the whole lobster if they can get the lobster, and if there's enough meat in the head? And so for most of the lobsters that are taken out of the water, the head is put back. So there's a ton of heads, like as Maya said, there's a ton of heads lying around, and so the triggerfish, if that's not enough of a meal for it, the triggerfish will go to another head. But for our studies, that would, for a 3-hour period, that was enough for the triggerfish to not kill the live lobster.
Do you know if there's a shelf life? If they'll only eat a head after a certain amount of time, or just eat the whole
The question was, is there like a shelf life for the appeal of the discarded lobster head? So the heads that we used in our trial were mainly frozen heads, and there was no problem with that. Our research didn't investigate if there was any problem with it happening in a natural environment. Yes?
You guys catch it out of species? The question was, did you guys catch any other species? And kind of a funny story. I was hand lining for triggerfish, and I did pull up a slippery dick. So yes, we did catch other species. And for those who don't know what a slippery dick is, it's like a fish this big, and that's the actual name. So.